rather than to atone for our real moral guilts. So the plausibility of Christ's death is to deal with our sense of personal inadequacy. So that's one way we can just get out of the difficult message of sin. We swap guilt for shame. The second, I think, is we operate out of this vague sense that our message of sin doesn't work, so we just make it go low profile. We kind of blur it, tone it down. We mumble when we talk about sin and hope someone might pick up the message somehow, but all the time we're just throttling back on what it actually means. So we either adjust it by talking about shame as your personal inadequacy rather than your personal guilt, or we just make it low profile and throttle back on it. So I think we have to face up to the fact that one of the great challenges for the church today is how we make sense of sin to those who are outside of Christian faith. I would suggest even 100 years ago, it was much more straightforward. People generally had a sense of moral guilt. And so the message of justification was easier to get through because people had more of a sense that something was wrong with them, in line with the Bible's message. Today, the misalignment is huge. So this is our challenge. How do we make sense of sin to those who are outside of the church? Some of you might be familiar with a wonderful little book written by Cornelius Plantinga back in the 90s. It's a book on sin, and the title is Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a Breviary of Sin. Not the way it's supposed to be, a breviary of sin. And he has a wonderful opening section where he has the classic line, "It's about time someone put in a good word for sin." And I totally endorse that. And in this afternoon pre-forum session, I want us to put in a good word for sin. So this session we're in now is going to be broken down into three sections. First of all, I want us to look at how unbelievers typically hear and respond to our message of sin. So when we speak it, preach it, communicate it, what are they actually hearing? And what are their responses to what they hear? Then secondly, in our second section, I want to look at what I'm calling three secular accounts for what's wrong with the world. Really, it's the equivalent of their sin narratives, their sin labels. So how do unbelievers account for what's wrong? And for me, it's critically important that we're clear on how unbelievers do this. And then thirdly, we're going to refresh ourselves briefly in what I call the Bible's weightier account for what's wrong with us. Okay, so there's my introduction. There's the three places we're going to go to. I wonder if we can just stop here for a moment and break out into our small groups so we can reflect a little bit on what I've just said. The questions I suggest you might want to talk about in your group is, do you agree with what I've said so far? That making sense of sin to an unbeliever is a huge challenge. Is this something you have found in your experience? And then to talk amongst yourselves and ask, how do you see the church responding to this challenge today? What are they doing in terms of meeting this great challenge of making sense of sin? Well, that was introduction. Let's move on now. I said in the first section, I wanted to look at basically typically the way an unbeliever would hear our account of sin, typical secular responses, how our unbelieving friends would pick up the message as we shared it. Now, I think if we're Christians, it's essential that we're aware of this. We need to put ourselves in the place of people who are listening to what we're saying and ask, how do they perceive it? What are they picking up? Now, of course, the Christian message of sin confronts all human persons as moral agents. And the Bible says we are totally responsible for our actions because we have moral agency. And the twist the Christian view gives is that Our responsibility is to a holy God who made us. He has the authority to describe how we should live, so our lives are ultimately accountable to him. And the Bible says when our lives and actions are weighed in the balance before this God, we're all condemned. We're condemned as sinners. The Bible's very strong in this point, and we are deserving of a most serious punishment because of that. And then the good news comes in that God has sent his son Jesus to die in our place, and he has taken on himself the serious punishment we deserved so we can be set free. That's the gospel message. Now, in terms of the first part of that, moral agency to a holy God, I want to suggest there are three categories of response in terms of how the unbeliever would hear this message. The first, perhaps surprising to you, is that our sin message, our sin diagnosis, is actually immoral. They hear what we're saying here as an immoral message. For God to call us out on our sin is for many today a complete outrage. And that's because the Christian message of sin against God has been completely reversed in the secular outlook. So it's not that we have sinned against him, but that he, God, has sinned against us. Now, I sense lots of Christians are a bit naive on this point, but this is increasingly the default response. It's not us who are immoral, it's God who is immoral. And to some degree, this is consistent within the secular humanist perspective. Because from the Enlightenment viewpoint, humans have created a much better moral order for the world. And without God and without his religion, Christianity in the center ground, the world has become a morally better place. And it's interesting, many historians, I think rightly, see the Enlightenment very much as a response to the brutality of what are known as the religious wars of Europe. This is one of the negative outcomes that came from the 16th century Reformation. So many good outcomes, but a very negative one was religious wars between Calvinists and Lutherans and Calvinists and Catholics. It's a horrible story. And actually this, many historians say, resulted in the secular mindset. We can't leave it to religion to create a better world. Humanism has to take responsibility for it. And because of that, many believe humans are morally better than God. So if God does exist, he is the morally culpable one who deserves our condemnation. And they would say, you just have to read the Old Testament, and the evidence for this is obvious. Here's a God who commands that homosexuals and adulterers be stoned. Here's the God, they say, if you read the Old Testament, who ordered the genocide of ethnic peoples who were in the way of his agenda. The God of genocide. So increasingly, today, the notion that God sees us as sinners is just completely outrageous. God is more the cause of what's the worst in our world rather than its solution. It's interesting, a few years ago, an atheist friend I have here in Cambridge, we were sharing a beer together. He says, Andrew, just tell me again, let me have it. Your gospel, your good news, your message, your thing, what is it? So I just told it to him straight up. Jesus, the Son of God, the eternal Son of God, he became incarnate, he took on flesh, he became fully a human, and as a human, he lived a life of perfect moral perfection. And as a morally perfect one, he died on the cross to satisfy divine justice against us. And because of this death, we are made acceptable to God. You know what his reply was? He said, oh, interesting, Andrew. Let me tell you my gospel. If your God existed, and if he came down to this earth in human flesh, I would demand this of him. I'd say, God, if you get on your knees now, and if you repent hard enough and authentically enough for all the misery you perpetrated on the human race, for cancer, for child abuse, for poverty, for tsunamis. You repent genuinely enough, and then maybe, if you do it well enough, I will forgive you. He says, Andrew, that's my gospel. And I would suggest that actually reflects many people's understanding today. Our message of sin against God is just an immoral message. So that's the first response. The second response is this. Of course, people would say there are evil people in the world who need punishing, but that doesn't apply to me. It's not my problem. I know there's a problem in the world, but it's not mine. So these kind would have no problem acknowledging that there are really, really bad people who deserve punishment. Hitler, Stalin, many would add today, Donald Trump, or whoever you want to list. World leaders who've caused mayhem. Now, it's interesting. I mentioned a moment ago this TV drama series, Breaking Bad. It's actually the premise of the whole series. The scriptwriter is a guy called Vance Gilligan. And when he was young, he had a Christian girlfriend. And this Christian girlfriend obviously had an influence on him. And Gilligan says, it's interesting, my girlfriend believes in heaven. But as an atheist, I, of course, can't believe in heaven. But, he says, when I look at the 20th century, I certainly have to believe in a hell. Because there's people like Pol Pot, Hitler, Joseph Stalin, men whose brutality killed millions. They made a mountain of misery, and they never really had to pay for it. So Gilligan says there has to be a hell. There has to be punishment for such kinds of people. So it's interesting. Yes, there's a problem, but it's not mine. There are really evil people out there who need punishment. They're the sinners, not me. And it's interesting today, we have a much greater global perspective on what's going on. And I think because of modern media, we have a different scale in terms of how we see evil. We can see, those of us who read a bit of history, how Stalin's purge led to the starvation of millions of people. We know about the gulags. And we say, yes, such people are truly evil, and evil on that scale needs punishing. But that doesn't apply to me. So when the Christian view of sin, which makes us all culpable, just clashes with this view, it's hard to relate. It seems so disproportionate. My small misdemeanors before that of Pol Pot and Stalin. So yes, there's a problem in the world, but it's not my problem. The third response would be this. Yes, I really am a mess. Someone in my breakout group mentioned this point. I'm really a mess, but my issue more is with your diagnosis. And I think today increasing numbers really know they are messed up. The TV dramas really are onto something. There's something warped and crooked and messed up about all of us. I observe today that many TV dramas, you watch them and you think to yourself, all of these people are antagonists. There's no protagonist. There's no good guy here, good girl. They're all pretty bad. An acknowledgement, yep, that we are a mess. And the question is, well, why are we a mess? So I think increasing numbers today may be able to relate to the part of the gospel that says you need saving. There's something deeply flawed with you. But what they can't accept is the sin diagnosis for what's really wrong, that we are culpable for our corruption. And that's where I'm going to focus in my second main section. This is going to be the main body of this session, the conflict in the diagnosis. So this third one, yep, I'm a mess. I have a problem, but your diagnosis as a Christian is the wrong one. So those are the three common responses that I'd put out there for you to reflect on. What's wrong with people? We both agree with that. But the Christian message, people would say it's immoral because God is the problem, or they'd say it doesn't really apply to me because there's real evil in the world that I'm not part of. And others who would say, yes, I'm messed up, really messed up, but your diagnosis of the problem is the wrong one. Okay, let's break out again, Caleb, and again, Caleb will put the questions into the chat room. The questions are, have you experienced these typical responses that I put out there? That our message of sin is immoral, that it's not really applicable to the ordinary person. And third, yes, I'm messed up, but I don't like the way you diagnose it. And then maybe you could think together of other reactions to the Christian message of sin in terms of how it's heard. Let's move on. We've looked in our last section at what I've called the three typical secular responses to our message of sin. What I really want to focus on now, the main body of my presentation, I want to look at three secular accounts for what's wrong with the world. As I've said, both Christians and non-Christians would agree something is terribly wrong. The difference is in our account for that. And I think as Christians, we really have to understand the accounts that secular people give. And I call these their secular sin labels. We've got to grasp them and grapple with them because this is how people are thinking. So what I'm going to do now is to highlight how unbelievers have relabeled sin without actually using the word sin. So it's important to say they haven't completely rejected the notion of sin. They've simply renamed it and redefined it and given it a different causal link for why it exists. Now, as we examine these three secular sin labels, I think as Christians, we must see and acknowledge the half-truths that each of these accounts contains. There is a validity to each of these diagnoses and labelings. And I would go so far as to say that they actually add something to our understanding of how sin impacts humans. So they're not to be discounted. We have to take them seriously. But as we will see, there's a serious deficiency in each of them. So let's look at the first one. The first secular sin label is what I call a problem with our hardware. It's a hardware issue. In his famous book, Leviathan, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes used this statement to describe our species. It's not very flattering. Hobbes said this, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this word brutish is an interesting one. It implies that humans basically function at the level of the animal. So when we look at what's wrong within this perspective, the cause of why we misfire is a physiological one. So it's a materialistic explanation for what's wrong with us. Whatever's bent out of shape in us is how nature has determined us. So it's the way I'm hardwired in my biology, or it's the neural brain structure that actually makes me do certain things. Steven Pinker makes this point in his book, The Blank Slate. He says the causes of behavior are inside the organism rather than out in the world. So the problem is in our organic nature. That's what makes us what we are. That's what's wrong with us. Many of you will be familiar with Yuval Harari, the Jewish historian, his famous book, Homo Deus. And in this book, he says this: today, when scholars ask why a man drew a knife and stabbed someone to death, the answer, because he chose to, doesn't cut the mustard. Instead, geneticists and brain scientists provide a much more detailed answer. He did it due to such and such electrochemical processes in the brain that were shaped by a particular genetic makeup, which in turn reflect ancient evolutionary pressures coupled with chance mutations. Now that's a hardware account. That's why this stabbing took place. Genetics, electrochemical processes in the brain, and so forth. Now, Richard Dawkins famously made a similar point with his selfish gene thesis. It too would fit under this particular labeling. Humans are hardwired, he says, to choose for self-interest, to promote what he called our in-house gene pool. That's the selfish gene, to protect our own genetic likeness. our own family. That's what promotes our behavior. Now, it's interesting to read of recent discoveries in neuroscience that have uncovered what's known as our cognitive self-serving bias, selfishness in the brain. And the theory goes, and I think there's truth to it, our brains operate so we come to less than fully rational conclusions about ourselves. So when good things happen, who do we attribute it to? Our brains attribute good things and its cause to us. We're responsible for that. But when bad things happen, who do we attribute it to? Not to us, it's somebody else's faults. Now, a lot of the world's problems flow from these biases. I'm responsible for good stuff that happens. Other people is responsible for the bad stuff that happens to me. There's recent work in the field of biology that's focused in on what they call the aggression gene. Some people seem more genetically predisposed to anger than others, just as some are more genetically predisposed to psychosis. And this is related to this upsurge of interest in the psychopath, this mass murder fascination we started out with. What makes people do that? Well, a lot of the attention is to hardware causes, to brain circuitry. What is it that makes the mass murder in terms of how we're wired, how we're hardwired? Now, of course, this particular secular sin label is naturalistic in its foundation. It's the inescapable conclusion of naturalism. Everything that belongs to nature defines what we are, and it works by what we call Tennyson's law. Tennyson, the great poet, who talked about everything being red in tooth and claw. That's how nature works, and it's how it works in us, red in tooth and claw. Joseph Conrad, the famous English Victorian writer, he also saw humans within the hardware account. Conrad said this: to be part of the animal kingdom under the conditions of this earth is very well, but as soon as you know of your slavery, the pain, the anger, the strife, the tragedy begins. We can't return to nature since we can't change our place in it. Our refuge is in stupidity. There is no morality, no knowledge, and no hope. There is only the consciousness of ourselves, which drives us about in a world that is always but a vain and floating appearance. So, this is the hardware diagnosis, and there's no doubt that this does play a part in what's wrong with us. It's something we should never forget. There is a half-truth in this diagnosis. Over the years, I've worked with quite a few homeless people, and you get to know their stories. And quite often, it's a similar kind of story, that homeless people are hardwired for deep depression. It's in their family genetics. And it was their deep depression that drove them to compensate through the use of alcohol or drugs. So that led to their substance abuse, which ultimately led to their homelessness, genetically based depression leading to the terrible condition of homelessness and substance abuse. You can trace the link. Now let's think for a moment about how this hardware diagnosis seeks to deal with the problem. The problem is in our nature, so how do we deal with it? Well, the first approach is to try and civilize the brutishness in us. And that's exactly what Thomas Hobbes is advocating in his book, Leviathan. Leviathan is a monstrous creature of legend, a famous one. And Hobbes argues that our brutish state of nature can only be tamed by the rule of an absolute sovereign. We need the kind of state which can domesticate us with a strong arm. So he argues for the necessity of the strongest government possible to tame the beast. He wants a government which is omnipotent, one that cannot be destroyed or divided. And it needs to be so strong that it inspires fear in humans, even on pain of death, to tame us and domesticate us. Now that's an extreme civilizing option. There are gentler ones, and actually lots of them around today. You see this in sport today. There's the stamp out racism campaign. We have to civilize racism out of us. It's in our nature. We've got to get it out through a civilizing process. So that's one approach to it. The second, and this one really interests me, is the development of a new science of good and evil. So interesting to me to observe how science is taking increasing responsibility for moral matters. In the past, science largely stayed clear of those matters. They left it to philosophers and ethicists and theologians to deal with moral matters. But we live now in an age of scientism. This is the new epistemology that says there's no part of reality beyond the remit of science, including ethics. So science is moving strongly into the morality business. This recently showed up for me in the Distinguished American Association for the Advancement of Science. Not long ago, they did a science webinar with the title Impulses, Intent, and the Science of Evil. And here were the questions up for discussion. They asked how we might define evil and whether there are evil people or just evil acts. Secondly, whether studying evil can broaden our understanding of the causes and triggers of violence. And was it the link between mental illness? What is the link between mental illness and evil acts? So the science of evil. It's interesting, the American new atheist Sam Harris is someone who really advocates a new science of good and evil. And he assumes that this science is going to support liberal values of human equality and personal autonomy. He just assumes that's going to happen without ever explaining why that's going to happen. But he says if we can just get our science of evil and good right, good society will prevail. Now, what is significant about this new approach to the problem of evil, that it doesn't leave much place for pastors and preachers and theologians when it comes to addressing the problem. Prior to the secular age, the priest and the theologian were seen as the sin experts, but now increasingly it's going to be the scientist, because it's a hardware problem. They have the truest understanding. So what place then is there for Christians to speak into this matter? Now, it's important for us to hear then how the Bible's account of sin is heard within the secular sin labeling. When you tell a person that sin is moral culpability for God, they're going to hear it as, hang on, you're judging me for how I'm hardwired. As the late Christopher Hitchens liked to say about Christianity, he says it teaches you that you're created sick and commanded to be well. That was his objection to Christianity. Created sick in terms of it's in our nature, our hardwiring, and commanded to be well. So holding someone accountable who holds to the hardware account is going to sound rather cruel. Now, while acknowledging some of the reality of this hardware account, Christians would say rightly that there are some serious limitations to it. And I think one of the great dangers in the hardwire account is that it diminishes agency. Our fundamental problem is now just reduced to disease. Hitchens were created sick, created diseased in terms of our hardwiring, our physiology. So the hardware labeling makes our problem a kind of illness. We're victims to our sickness. And while there may be some truth to this, the hardware diagnosis is very weak. And it's weak and even dangerous for me because it takes away any metaphysical dimension to evil. So think of the Holocaust as an example. Some of us, when we were meeting in Wiesla, hopefully we'll be meeting there again soon, took the chance to go to Krakow and visit Auschwitz. Now that is one of the most sobering experiences you can possibly have. I could hardly speak the next day. I was so traumatized by Auschwitz. When you saw the scale of evil, it defies the imagination. And you'd say, surely the Holocaust, surely the Stalinist purges require an account of evil with some genuine metaphysical categories beyond naturalism, that the scale of the evil just demands something more. So can we really look at the colossal evils of the 20th century in something like Auschwitz and account for it merely on hardware terms? a misfiring in our neural circuits. So the real problem, the deeper problem with this hardware account is that it makes evil banal and shallow. It's a terrible reduction when it comes to the problem of evil. And whenever a culture veers towards the banality of evil, we put ourselves in great danger. Because when evil becomes banal, it's just the way things are in our neural circuits and our genetics, we become much more passive to it. It's just the way things are. So I think there's something terribly dangerous about this particular sin labeling. And here I want to raise a crucial part of the Christian account of evil. And here we really do bring in the metaphysical. We believe in a devil, part of the supernatural realm. And I think a proper understanding of evil on the scale of Auschwitz requires Satan. You see there's something diabolical. Here's evil that's not just a problem, something gone amiss in our neural circuits. Here's a malevolent force that rages and burns with catastrophic potential. And this is the great limitation, I would say, of the hardware account. There's an interesting book by an American author called Andrew Delbanco. And the book's entitled The Death of Satan, How Americans Have Lost the Sense of Evil. I don't agree with everything in this book, but it's interesting. Andrew Delbanco, The Death of Satan, How Americans Have Lost the Sense of Evil. Okay, so you think about software, say computer software, and that implies someone who programs it. So software is about being programmed by another person. So if the problem in me is a software one, other people have contributed to the bad programming. So it's this that makes us go rogue. So here, the problem isn't so much in my nature as it is in my nurture, in my parenting, in my siblings, and my friendship groups, influence of my teachers, and the list goes on and on. It's my nurture. That's programmery in the wrong way. I've been fascinated by years with the Joker character, you know, the Batman films, and the latest Joker film starred and Joaquin Phoenix stars as the Joker is really quite interesting. Because the Joker, who's the antagonist to Batman, is this fictional character who's a really bad person. He does really bad things, but he carries it out like a clown. And the question we've asked for years is, why is the Joker like this? Well, the latest film highlighted that it was a software issue, because in his past, the Joker was subjected to terrible abuse. And it's this that led to his psychopathic behavior. That's the diagnosis. That's what produced the Joker. Now, I think if you listen to the news, you often hear this same secular sin label at work. A few years ago, there was a news story in the UK that caught the national attention. There was a fairly normal kid who just one day brought a plane ticket to Syria and joined a jihadi militia group. And everybody started talking. It was part of the chatter. What made this young man do that? He seemed so normal. He did so well at school. He had normal parents. So what happened? Was it something in the school ground? Some kind of nurture issue that led him to go wrong? Now, again, I would say Christians should never ignore this side of the explanation. There's almost always an element of truth to the nurture issue as to why we are what we are. And I'd suggest that Christianity has a theology of sin that can include this diagnosis. So we should never minimize how others impact us negatively, and that actually translates into our behavior, how we act out in the world. A few years ago, I heard a heartbreaking story from a young woman. I used to work in L'Abri. And this young woman had a normal background. She came from a middle-class American family, hugely gifted. They were quite wealthy. She had so much promise. And one day, totally unexpectedly, she was raped. And the level of trauma from her rape was so great that she just couldn't function anymore. And she was actually working at that point. And because of the trauma, she couldn't hold down her job. Because she couldn't hold down her job, eventually she became homeless. Becoming homeless, she eventually became a prostitute. And being a prostitute, she basically succumbed to a terrible drug addiction issue. It's all starting from a rape that she had no responsibility for. Now that's a terribly extreme story, but all of us can tell how we've been negatively impacted from the treatment of others. And it's impacted our psyche, our software. So we have to take this part of the diagnosis very seriously. Now where Christians tend to use the label of sin, the problem of our sin, the software account uses the label of disorder. And that means the problem is usually medicalized. So when we look at this secular sin label, we see that it largely medicalizes sin. And that's why what's required in terms of a solution is a therapeutic intervention. It's the therapist that has the tools to diagnose and to get to the underlying problem. And again, that's why this particular sin label doesn't leave much place for the pastor, the preacher, the youth leader. We can't say much of these issues. Because for someone who works within this software account, it's the insight of the therapist trained to diagnose this level of problem that's going to get to something. So what could the theologian possibly add? So as experts in psychological pathology, they're the ones who are going to get us. They're going to understand our dysfunction. And clearly within this labeling, what's required is not the gospel, but medicine, pharmacology, or a shrink. And again, this path for diagnosis and treatment is often highly successful because it is dealing with something real. But what it means for Christianity, that it's hard to compete with the therapeutic on its own terms. They're just so far ahead. And so we sort of follow their lead and try to take them on their territory. So how is the biblical message of sin heard within this particular secular sin label? Well, when you tell a person they're a sinner and morally culpable before God, they're going to hear it as, hang on, you're judging me for what someone else is entirely responsible for. And again, that just feels terribly cruel. What I am is a result of how I've been programmed by others, and you're telling me I'm morally culpable before God? Here I am with this mental illness, which has seriously impacted me, and my therapist helped me to see that this is related to the bad parenting I had, and you're telling me the problem is my sin against a holy God. And this is part of our challenge. Now, I would say while acknowledging that the software account rightly diagnoses part of the problem, there is again some serious limitations to this particular account. And once more, as with our former account, the one we looked at last time, this one falls into what we might call a victim narrative. A victim narrative. And victim narratives diminish your sense of agency and responsibility. Now, I think this particular labeling does better than the hardware one, which I think at the end makes evil totally banal. So I think the software account does a better job at explaining Hitler, whether it be his little man syndrome or his upbringing or his experience as a soldier in World War I. It does better at beginning to unpack that. But I think the limitation in the software account is that it tends to reduce people to their mental disorder. And it does this in a way that the hardware account doesn't do. I don't hear many describe themselves primarily from within their brain chemistry or their genes. So I wouldn't say to you, hello, my name is Andrew, and I got an anger problem because it's part of my genetic composition. But I hear lots of people who identify themselves by their mental disorder. I'm a depressive. I've been abused. So it's the kind of labeling that tends to reduce people to their mental disorder. They become identified by their problem. And I think Christianity, while acknowledging that we are victims, truly victims of other people's sin, won't allow for us to identify by our disorder. It can allow for it, but it doesn't allow it for us to identify ourselves by that. No one is identified essentially by the abuse they've suffered at the hands of another person, because all of us are the imago Dei. We're the image of God. We're persons with value and significance that go beyond our mental health categories. And as I've worked with people over the years who have mental disorders, this has actually often been a very key insight for them. They discover they're more than their mental disorder. This doesn't ultimately signify me, make me what I am. I'm not identified primarily by this. The Christian anthropology allows for that. So that's the second secular sin label, what I call the software one, more rooted in our nurture, how we've been programmed by others negatively, how that leads to our disorder internally, how that impacts our behavior. Yes, lots of truth in this, lots of half-truths, but I think also, again, a reduction in terms of what the real problem is. So let's break out once again. And the question here is, do you think the software diagnosis has significantly shaped the church's view of sin? And how do you see this? Many have commented that our view of sin in the church has become therapized, become very therapeutic. And do you agree with that, that perhaps this is now how we tend to see the issue of sin? So we've covered two secular sin labels, the hardware account, the software account. Now we're going to come to our third one, which is really all about social causation. So the problem is a structural one in the social realm. So it's external social factors that make us go rogue. So this account basically starts from the point that humans are innately decent and good, and it's society that turns us into something ugly. Now, I just want to assure you that this has huge cachet in our culture today. So many buy into this one. There's a recently published book by a guy called Rutger Bregman. It's a bestseller. It's just called Humankind. And this summarizes the thesis of his whole book very well. He says, with the dawn of civilization, Homo Papi's ugliest side came to the fore. Civilization is the problem. It's social. History books chronicle countless massacres by Israelites and Romans, Huns and Vandals, Catholics and Protestants, and many more. And his thesis was, when we were small tribes, we didn't go to war. All the stuff about tribes eating each other is nonsense. We lived harmoniously, and it's as we became civilized, civilization dawns, we become more socially structured, that all the problems began. So here's the focus for the problem. Civilization is, the social is. So society now is given the face of evil. Here's the big baddie. It's society that oppresses us, and we are its victims, and it makes us bad. So what goes wrong with humans is directly related to organized society. It could be its class system. And today would be the white supremacy that goes with the class system of Western civilization. Or it could be the failure when it comes to education. Some get highly educated, the best education, others socially get the worst. Or society blocks social mobility, so the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. Or you could look at the tribalistic nature of society, where the working classes are forced to live in their concrete jungles and the ugly places of our cities. And the only opportunity they have in such places is through crime. They're socialized to crime. They can really take no other path. So it's because of this that people often today use some version of this excuse, society made me do it. big bad society. Some years back, 2011, there was summer riots here in the UK, and David Cameron, our prime minister back then, talked about sick society being responsible for this. So our prime minister, the problem, this is sick society. Now, again, as Christians, we shouldn't write this label off too quickly, because the social fabric we're in really does play a cause in disordering our lives. So there are elements of this labeling that really require careful thought and attention. I think education, good education, is a huge benefit at so many levels of a person's life. And actually, as we think about these things as Christians, it should be the spur for us to certain kinds of social action, because we see that there is a linkage between the two. Now, to understand this particular secular sin labeling, we really need to grapple with the thought of Rousseau. Rousseau is the 18th century Swiss-born philosopher. And in his book, The Origins of Inequality, Rousseau argues that humans in their original state weren't sinful. Naturally, we're born into a state of innocence. So it's quite the opposite of the Bible's account. So Rousseau strongly advocates that the human default is to the good. And he gives the reasons for this state of innocence as there being no society. It's Rutgers' argument again. So this is known as his noble savage theory. Before society, we were noble, we were good. Pre-society people, he said, didn't feel greed, they didn't feel envy. Their only natural emotion was pity for the suffering of others. And the problem, according to Rousseau, began with this discovery of society. Civilization rises. This is where it all begins to go wrong, because it's now something outside of the individual, and it exists as a mass of rules and structure and artificial relationships. And it's the social institution that breeds our corruption and our wickedness. Now, Rousseau's ideas have taken a really deep hold on modern thought. Even if people know nothing of this philosopher, he is one of the great influencers of our time. And his ideas carry on in lots of modern philosophical discourse, each of which are committed to this particular secular sin label, that humans are naturally good, but external social factors have messed it up. So you see this in the political theory of Gramsci, who's an Italian Marxist philosopher and the inventor of what's known today as cultural Marxism. You also see something similar in the approach of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher. He looked at society through the prism of power and negative power. So society for him is not a system of trust and tradition that evolve over time. It's just badly executed power by those who are at the top of the ladder. So those who hold power are the perpetrator of everything that's bad. They're the sinners, and we are its victims. You see it also in what's known as the Frankfurt School. These are the inventors of what's known as critical theory. And we won't get into that, but again, a similar kind of framework for understanding. Human default to the good, society, social institutions make us bad. Now, each of these offers something unique in terms of their argument, but that's the common thread. The ruin of humanity is due to the social rule of those who have power, those who have dominance, which in Western civilization are those who are white, who are male, who are heterosexual, and those who are able-bodied. These are the ones who have control of the social institutions, and through this, they misuse their power and oppress minorities. They enslave them. And those who are minorities, not white, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, are victims of this dominance. So that includes women, people of color, non-heterosexuals, and today those who transcend gender, the transgender movement. Now, this today has become the lens for understanding what's wrong with the world. So exposing evil means seeing through this web of society that we've been born into. And this particular social web is conspiring to keep the minority silent and passive to the evil. And we have to resist this by speaking out. We've got to stop being silent. That's the rhetoric behind Black Lives Matter. It's time to speak out. So because society is the cause of evil, back to Rousseau, our task is to deconstruct this web of social evil. And what that means today is that every discussion around what's wrong with us is reduced to sexuality, gender, and race. And as the English intellectual Douglas Murray comments in his book, The Madness of Crowds, this is a commitment that everything, absolutely everything, should be made political. Because only by making things political can we fix what's wrong with humans. Now, again, this makes what's wrong with us, one more time, a victim narrative. We are victims of oppression. So it's all about how we have been oppressed by the evil web of society. Or if we're white and if we're male, it's how we've colluded in the system which has been handed down to us, and we have to escape it. Now, these are complex issues in which there are half-truths. But the point I'm making really here is that when it comes to diagnosing the problem, what can a theologian or a preacher possibly say? Unless, of course, they bought into Marxist ideology or what's known as liberation theology. So in this particular sin labeling, there's no one better to diagnose evil than the social scientists. They are the new high priests who can see through the evil. And they have this enormous power and authority today in terms of this particular secular sin narrative we're looking at. Who can compete with the social scientist? Now, it's useful, again, to ask how the Bible's message of sin is heard within this labeling. Because when you tell a person they're a sinner and morally culpable before God, they're going to hear it as, hang on, you're judging me as a sinner when I'm the one who's oppressed by an evil system. It's a double whammy. I'm the sinner when I'm actually a victim of oppression under an evil system. And of course, in the West, we shouldn't forget that Christianity has been dubbed the white man's religion, which it certainly is not. It's Middle Eastern at first, and then it goes into North Africa, and it comes to Europe much later. But because it's dubbed white man's religion, it's seen as so much the cause of our social injustice in the world today. And that's where the moral outrage begins to come in. How dare you call me a sinner when it's your system that's largely the cause of all the social injustice I'm suffering? So it makes it very sensitive. So it's no wonder in the light of this that many Christians have been tempted to abandon their doctrine of sin. And they're trying to reconfigure the message that takes the sin dimension out. We want to make it attractive in the light of these charges. So there really is a huge challenge to making sin plausible today in the light of this particular sin labeling. Now, again, while acknowledging the half-truths of the social account that we have to take very seriously, Christians would say rightly that there are some serious limitations in this diagnosis. And the big one for me is this: does this Rousseauian viewpoint of the human default to the good actually stand up to scrutiny? So I go to its starting point. We are naturally good, and it's society and its structures that make us bad. Now, there's no doubt that humans have lots of self-potential, but all this positivity about the good in us, I think, is radically out of alignment with reality. The fact is, we inflict wrong on others willfully and repeatedly, and yet we refuse to admit this. Now, there's a remarkable book I read a few years ago called The Shanghai Compound by Langdon Gilkey. I highly recommend this. And I call the thesis of the book the Shanghai Compound Experiment. So it's a remarkable story, and that's what it is, a piece of history set in World War II. And basically what happens is that there's a Japanese prisoner of war camp for 2,000 foreign civilians. Now, these civilians are not subject to torture, rather they're just left to run their own affairs with limited food and in limited space. And Langdon is appointed one of the leaders of the camp. And Langdon is an educated humanist. He's totally committed to the viewpoint that the default of humans is innately good. So he started out thinking Shanghai's going to work wonderfully because everybody's best interests will come out. And his observation of what actually happened in Shanghai shattered his humanism. He said, quote, in his book, "One of the peculiar conceits of modern optimism, and a conceit which I had fully shared, is the belief that in time of crisis, the goodness of men comes forward. For some reason, we think that when there is little food or space among a community of people, there will be more rather than less apt to share with one another in the ordinary well-fed existence. Nothing indicates so clearly the fixed belief in the innate goodness of humans as does this confidence that when the chips are down and when we are revealed for what we really are, we will all be good to each other." He ends. Nothing could be so totally in error. He goes on. Self-interest seemed almost omnipotent next to the weak claims of logic and fair play. These are his real observations of what happened in Shanghai. And he says, the trouble with my new humanism, I found myself deciding, was not its confidence in human science and technology. It was rather its naive and unrealistic faith in the rationality and goodness of the men who yielded these instruments. One more quote. This was so devastating. He said, the most obvious dilemma had been the moral one. Men must be just, fair, and generous if a creative and stable society is to be possible at all. And yet, apparently, this is for us a supremely difficult, if not impossible, task. How are we to understand ourselves? Why does such an obvious necessity seem so unattainable and even unnatural to our present nature? As in camp, I continue to find both the humanistic and the rigidly pietistic answers to these questions unsatisfactory. And then you'll see the rest of the quote on the PowerPoint. Those humanists who insist that men are naturally wise and good enough to be moral seem to me to be continually refuted by the patent persistence of dangerous selfishness among people whose intentions were good. The Shanghai Compound experiment just devastates this idea that we have this natural default to good. So once more, as with the other two accounts that we've looked at, the problem with this particular secular sin label that it, again, falls into a victim narrative. And it doesn't take seriously enough the human default to the bad. And I think when we look back on various 20th century social experiments to deal with the problem, we can see how utterly failing it's been. It's premised on when we fix society, justice will prevail and good will reign. This was the hope of the communist revolution back in 1917. So the Russian ideologue Vladimir Lenin, he was moved by a vision of what a social fix would do. It's going to create utopia, he said, for essentially good people. Well, did Lenin's vision create a better world? No, it created a monster that only ended in 1991. A failed social experiment to fix the world. And what about the social experiment of the Nazis that began in the 1920s? They wanted to clean up society. Bohemian society, make a better world. And again, it created a monstrosity of evil. And we see this in the human death camps. I think we have lots of reason to be very wary of social fixes to the problems of our worlds. And there is more than enough evidence that this particular secular sin label is flawed, both in terms of diagnosis and solution. And I find it worrying that today we're going after this with such a renewed fervor. This is the hope of today's SJWs, social justice warriors. We have to attack the web of social evil and create a fix. And it's never happened in the past, and it's never going to happen in the future. It's a doomed exercise. Partially right in its diagnosis, but definitely not a fix. Okay, so there they are. So much could be more, could be said on the three of them. I've got tons more material, but we've got to leave it at that. The three secular sin labels of our time, we've looked at each with a diagnosis that has some merit, requiring our serious attention, but none of them going far enough and making sense of what's wrong with us and what's wrong with the world. So this is going to be our last little breakout, and then a fairly short conclusion on the Bible's view of it all. And the question for this particular breakout is, how much has the social fix to the problems of the world influenced you? Time for confession here, because there's a lot of this going on today. Their identity politics is all about the social fix. How much has the social fix of the problem influenced you? So this is the last stretch. We're one more time around the track. So this is into our last section, where I want to just briefly look at the Bible's weightier account about the problem of the world. And we can only touch on a few things briefly, but I really want to highlight places where the Bible's labeling comes into conflict with the three secular sin narratives we've been looking at. And the first thing that strikes me as we wrestle with the Bible's account is that it doesn't confuse symptoms for causes. So broken biology, psychological disorder, and bad social conditions, though real, are only symptoms of a much deeper problem. So labeling causes and symptoms well is extremely important, and the Bible does this, of course, as the revelation of the Almighty does this perfectly. So the biblical viewpoint has categories that allows us to distinguish between, these are causes of the world problem and the problem in me, and these are symptoms of the causes. So when we look at the three secular sin labels, the Bible's view would affirm each of these as symptoms, significant symptoms of the problem, symptoms in our bodies, symptoms in our psyche, symptoms in the social environment. But none of these are the ultimate cause of what sin is. And for me, this is so helpful. Causal links versus symptoms. And our world, the secular world, good at dealing with symptoms, but not good at dealing with real causes. So the symptoms are a real part of the story. We've got to take them seriously, but they're not the whole story. And I'd say even if you put these three together, it would create a quite remarkable picture. If we could get the full picture of the hardware problem, the software problem, and the social problem, we really have quite a view of things. And the trouble today is that people are divided between that. Hard scientists, the psychotherapists, the therapists, and then you've got the social scientists. Those hardly ever talk to each other. Put them together, it would be quite a picture, but it wouldn't be the complete picture because you're only dealing with symptoms. That's the first point I want to make here. The second point is that the Bible's account of sin focuses very much on the problem of the human condition. And when you see sin as the human condition, you get to the root cause. Sin is a corruption that touches the whole human person from the inside out. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant's getting at this when he talked about the crooked timber of humanity. What a phrase. The crooked timber, bent timber of humanity, bent all the way through. So there's a floor at the very core of us that keeps throwing up errors. And really, the core is what the Bible calls the heart. The very center of our personality is where our orientation is crooked. That's how deep the problem goes. That's the cause. The human heart is twisted and bent and at enmity with God. So locating the problem of sin like that does two things. First of all, it makes sin a personal matter. Sin is a personal problem in every human being. Physiology, mental health, social structures, as important as they are, all bypass ultimately the personal dimension. And when sin ceases to be a personal matter, it gets instrumentalized. So the mechanism for what's wrong is in my brain chemistry, or my mental health disorder, or how sick society has conditioned me. But if the problem goes to the core of our human condition, that makes sin personal. It's me who's the sinner, not my genes, not my depression, not my social context. And the moment you make sin personal, like the Bible does, it gives a solid metaphysical category beyond the physical, alongside the physical. It gives those kind of categories for sin and evil. So now we can begin to explain Auschwitz, the more extreme scale of evil. And we can do that because sin and evil occur on this level of the personal. And that brings intentionality with it, motive with it. Intentionality and motive are so key to what it means to be a person. And this goes beyond matter, beyond our environment. So emphasizing sin as our condition, that also makes us agents as well as victims. Stressing that sin is the problem of the human condition leaves room for both of these categories. Yes, we're victims. All of us are victims, without exception. And also, yes, we're all agents of the wrong. And this universal problem of the human condition means that all of us are responsible on the interpersonal level as agents of the wrong. It terrified me when I was a young father with these infants and toddlers. I knew, because I'd done enough reading in psychology, done enough training in it, that I was inevitably going to damage my children in some way. There's no way of avoiding it. They were going to be victims of my sin on them. I was going to mark them negatively as well as positively, just as mine marked me. So the Bible picks us up. If we're victims, and we're also agents. And everyone is implicated as an agent because sin is the human condition. No one is exempt as agents. As the Bible states that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, of the standard of his own holiness. And I'd say the problem with the secular sin labels is that they don't take agency seriously enough. And that's why it's produced a culture of victimhood. And this is just getting more and more extreme. It accounts for so much of the outrage in our culture. We're outraged because we've been victimized by social oppression. I wasn't born into wealth and privilege. I'm a victim of my abuser. I'm a victim of my genetic makeup. I'm going to blame my parents for my inherited depression. We're victims, victims, victims. And what the secular sin labels tend to avoid is how all of us contribute personally and intentionally to the problems of the world because we're bent and corrupted. There's a famous story, which I think is apocryphal, which is a bit of a shame, but we're going to tell it anyway. The great G.K. Chesterton, someone I admire enormously, the English journalist and novelist, poet and thinker. And basically this happened in the war period for World War I. And the Times of the UK invited several notable journalists and intellectuals to address what's going wrong with the world. Why is the world falling apart? Why is it on the brink of war? And GK wrote this to the Times: "Dear Sir, regarding your article, 'What is Wrong with the World?' I am, yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." Now that's what the biblical account pushes us to. What's wrong with the world? I am wrong with the world. My condition is what's wrong with the world, and it adds to the problem of the world. And the evidence for this is substantial. It's not too hard to prove it, that all of us are responsible for the problem of the world. And this emphasis on our being agents of sin may not be flattering, but I would say to some degree it's freeing, because then we can begin to take some responsibility for our lives and our actions. I think this is part of the attraction of Jordan Peterson, especially to young man. Come on, don't buy into the victim narrative, Peterson says. It makes you so passive. So stand up straight and then bend down and clean up your room. Do something constructive today. He's pushing against this victim narrative that makes us passive. So this goes back to the matter of sin being a personal matter. And a human person is not just the object of a certain kind of hardwiring, nor are we just the object of someone else's abuse. No, integral to being a person is to have agency, to have intentionality. We have future-directed thoughts that we act upon. That's what agency is. We're not just sticks floating on the water. We act on the world as agents, and that includes a moral capability. That's part of what it means to be the image of God. And as agents, our interpersonal nature can bring good to others, great blessing, and it can also be incredibly destructive and damaging. And this actually brings together the biblical viewpoint of what a human is. The Bible accounts for both of these, for why we bring good and blessing to the world because we're made in the image of God, and why there's so much wrong with us that brings a destructive impact because of the fall. Indeed, you could say the Bible's viewpoint on a human is paradoxical in the extreme. This is something that Blaise Pascal, one of my favorite thinkers of all time, he understood this so well. He understood that as the image of God, humans are the glory of the created order. And he says you can't overstate the wonder of what a human is. And at the same time, he said, as sinners, we are monstrous and terrible. And you can't stress too much just how bad we are. For Pascal, you couldn't exaggerate the paradox of the human condition. You can't overstate our nobility, and you can't overstate how cracked we are. So Christianity's default position on what it means to be human is basically that we are great enigmas. And this is what fascinated Pascal, the enigma of humans. Listen to him. He says, what sort of freak then is man? How novel, how monstrous, how chaotic, how paradoxical, how prodigious. Judge of all things, feeble earthworm, repository of truth, sink of doubt and error, the glory and refuse of the universe. You feel the contradiction, the paradox, the enigma in his language there. And for Pascal, even when he focused on our dark side, he said it was the wretchedness of a great lord, the wretchedness of a dispossessed king. And for him, as the Bible would assert, not even the worst evil of a human could remove that nobility. So a coherent view of what it means to be human has to offer an explanation for both of these. Pascal again, man's greatness and wretchedness are so evident that the true religion must necessarily teach us that there is in man some great principle of greatness and some great principle of wretchedness. As part of our condition, the imago Dei, created in the image of God and fallen, fundamentally corrupted by sin. Douglas Grotius writes of Pascal's thought, in surveying human philosophies and non-Christian religions, Pascal notes that they either exalt humans at the expense of taking seriously their weakness, or reduce humans to nothing at the expense of their significance. Very helpfully put. So, the Bible's weightier account, sin is our condition. We are corrupt to the core, and that makes sin personal. We're not just victims, we are agents, and we carry the problem in us to the world and bring the havoc and ruin of that to those around us. So, as I finish, what would I say to the seculars, to the unbelieving friend I have, to those who find Christianity's view of sin so offensive? Well, I would say this: there are things in your accounts that I need to learn from. There are things you have discovered in terms of what's wrong with the world that I need to add to my understanding. So I'm listening to you. to your hardware accounts. I want to understand more how the way we're wired physically and materially in our genes, and especially in our neural responses, how this adds to what's wrong in us and the world. And the same with understanding our psyche and how we've been conditioned negatively by others. And then especially today, all the rhetoric, all the conversation about social oppression. We need to listen. Many Christians just reacting against it. No, get involved and listen to what's going on and learn as much as you can. But then I would say to my unbelieving friend, while learning from your accounts, my problem is that they don't go nearly far enough. There's some serious shortcomings in your view, and I think I can show that to you. And I would then encourage them to consider the sin account given by Christianity. We take sin way more seriously than you at some problem. The problem's way more serious than you ever imagined. I found some traction in that kind of argument. And then to us as Christians, those of us who are here today, I would say this: even though the biblical view of sin may be implausible today and even offensive to the secular person, we must not let go of it, despite the resistance. And why mustn't we let go of it? Well, quite simply because it's true. And as Pascal said, there's plenty of evidence for it. Now, there's so much more that could have been said this afternoon and should have been said about what the Bible says of sin. And the Bible says a great deal about sin. Its diagnosis is God's diagnosis. He sees the whole picture. And I would say far from being an embarrassment to seriously wrestle with the Bible's view of sin is to see that it actually lines up with the real world. There's an explanatory power in it that makes sense of what's going on around us. And to grasp this is not oppressive, it's actually liberating because we see that diagnosis is true. So take it seriously. That's my encouragement to you. Don't back off. Take it even more seriously. And know that taking sin seriously isn't meant to plunge us into gloom. To take sin really seriously is actually to be directed to the real solution to the problem of our condition. The real solution being Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who came to rescue us from this crisis, to deliver us from this condition. And it's interesting, Scripture said that Jesus died not just to redeem us from the guilt of sin, although it all begins there, but ultimately he came to deliver us from the power of sin and its hold at the core of us. He wanted to treat the condition to make it possible for us to rise above our natural condition of sin, to allow us to live the good life that Jesus exemplified so perfectly. So this is not a moment for Christians to get weak on the biblical view of sin. Listen to the secular accounts, learn from them, but grasp deeply the weightier account. Lots of good theological writing on the subject right through the ages. Hang on to it, be faithful, be brave, and engage your non-Christians with this particular doctrine, which I think has real cachet value in terms of engaging them.